Okay, I think we're going to get going with the final presentations, please. I hope you had some good discussions in the development of scenarios. We're going to continue with the theme of implementing the agri-food framework that you worked through yesterday. In this section, we're going to talk about how to compare outcomes and impacts of different future scenarios. Sorry, Latinas, por favor. So I'm going to focus on ecosystem service impacts and economic impacts. And then my colleague will talk about measuring social and human impacts. And then we will go back to the worksheet and finish the final part before we're finishing for the day. So I know this panel of Will and me and Thomas might look kind of not very diverse, right? We might 3 tall white guys with glasses, same age. But I beg to differ. See, Thomas, he eats frites, and Will has chips, and I have French fries. And Thomas, he uses mayonnaise, and Will is vinegar, and for me it's ketchup. So we're very diverse. It's very different between us. Okay, so in a nutshell, scenarios are what you compare, and models are how you get metrics to compare them. So I know it's late in the afternoon and we're diving into a more technical theme, but this is the exciting part because this is the real guts of the agri-food framework. This is really implementing, measuring, and showing the results of the agri-food framework. So I'm going to talk a little from the same perspective as Thomas about developing the scenarios, but take that into measuring those scenarios. So the reason we develop scenarios is because we want to know how they could be different from the business as usual. But in order to measure and predict the differences and inform decisions around those scenarios, we must select methods and tools to model them, to get the information we want. So we have to think about what information do we want. This will help. So, and you can see in this diagram that there's the scenarios, and then there's various steps before you can get to informing a decision. So training on modeling to a diverse group like this could be a bit difficult because we might have some people who are modelers, they do modeling, and we might have other people who don't know the difference between a supermodel and a model train and maybe a model of the solar system, right? So I know that this could be a challenge, but I think I can speak to both of you. So we're talking about predictive models, models that could represent a cause and an effect, that could predict what could or should happen. So we can estimate differences between scenario A and B. These types of predictive models are designed to replace experiments in situations where we can't perform an experiment. We can't have a country implement a policy, spend 4 years trying to achieve those goals, and then go back in time and try a different one, right? So we try to model what would happen so that we can make the right choice from the beginning. So this here is an egg. If I drop this egg, you may have an idea of what could happen. Who thinks they know what will happen if I drop this egg on the floor? Depends. Well, if you think you know, you might be an expert. And we would ask you to give us an expert opinion. That would be an expert-based model. You could say, here's what's going to happen. I know I have lots of experience with eggs and dropping them. Here's what's going to happen. But let's pretend maybe we don't know what an egg is, and we've never seen one dropped. What else could we do to model the outcomes? One option, oopsie, not doing this very well. One option would be to use a data set on things that have been dropped. Maybe we have data on other things that have fallen and data on if they have broken or not. And maybe there's data on how heavy they were, how far they were dropped. And with that information, we can draw a correlative model and say, well, this egg is lighter than this object, but heavier than this object. It was dropped this far. With this statistical data, maybe we can estimate the probability it will break. That's a correlative model. Maybe we're physicists, and we can say, I've never seen an egg, but I know that gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared. I know that I can measure the grams of this egg, and I can measure the density of the air, the hardness of the floor and the shell, and I can create a process-based model to model the relationship between the egg falling and hitting the ground. And that information might be able to tell us what will happen if we drop the egg. So, or we run an experiment. So, realistically, modeling and implementing the agri-food framework will take multiple types of modeling. We'll have to put steps together. We'll have to know what is going to change physically, then what will change with the ecosystem services because of those drivers of change, and then maybe that's not enough. We want to know what is the impact of those changes in ecosystem services. Who's benefiting? How much? Can we quantify those things? So we're trying to answer a hypothesis of predicting the differences between complex scenarios. We need to determine, as best as we can, what would change. What differences between the ecosystem functions will translate to differences in ecosystem services. So we're evaluating your scenarios today with the agri-food framework. We're using the framework like a lens to look through and see what stocks and flows and impacts are most important. And we may want to go back to the exercise that we did with Kavita yesterday with the worksheet to look at those impacts and outcomes within your packet. They might give us some ideas for how could we measure some of those things. Do I have an idea for a model to model those outcomes? So I'm referring a lot to this TEEB's, what was it called, guidebook that Thomas was referencing. They have a lot of description of different modeling types. That's helpful. There's also a tool that Hannes introduced me to yesterday from WRI. And according to this study by WRI, over 80 different ecosystem services or related models have been used in recent years. That's a tremendous number of models. Obviously, we can't be an expert in all those models, or can I go through all those different types of models? So first I'm going to focus on this first box, which is modeling the changes in drivers. Normally this is land use change, but it could also be behavior change. Maybe you're doing the exact same land use, but you've changed your practices. You're somehow doing a different type of land management, and that could also have an outcome. So we first need a model to compare those things. And then secondly, modeling what are the impacts of those changes in ecosystem services. And these are the first two steps towards informing policy. And towards the end, I'll talk about the last step. So depending on the study topic and policy question, you may want to model different things. You may need to use different tools to get those answers. So what we're going to do is use those scenarios. We're going to use that agri-food framework. We're going to say, what are the impacts that we want, and how would we measure those? What would be, if I were to walk into a decision maker's office and show them information, what information would influence their policy making, would influence the action plans to implement that policy? What could help? So now I'm going to give some examples of a bunch of different models, and I just want to hear if anyone has used them. If you've used them, please raise your hand, and I just want like a one-line description of how did you use it, what did you do? So first of all, I've used Terset before. It's a plugin for ArcGIS. It allows you to predict land use change based on past changes. So let's say you have a map of year 2000, you have a map of 2010. You train the model on the changes that have occurred in those 10 years, and you have it predict, based on the probabilities of land types, what will happen in 2020, for example. And it produces a map of the hypothetical or probable future. There's another tool called MarkSan that's similar, and it was designed actually to model not changes from one land use type to another, but what if you implement a conservation, a protected area? If you conserve one area, could that have an impact? And so that's the driver of land use change. Has anyone used TEERSET or MarkSan? Okay. You have? Do you want to tell us what you use it for?
I use for protected areas.
MarkSan?
Yeah.
Okay. Was it helpful?
The black boxes, I don't like it so much.
Okay, it's a black box. Okay, good information. SWOT is the Soil and Water Assessment Tool. Has anyone used SWOT? No SWOT users? So SWOT is often used by engineers and hydrologists. It gives very detailed information about hydrology, movement of water from one area to another, based on different characteristics that you use from spatial tools, elevation, slope, soil type, land cover. So it's commonly used in hydrological modeling. How about Russell? Has anyone used Russell? Hannes, what did you use Russell for?
We did a case study in Ethiopia where we looked at how the soil erosion and deposition would influence soil productivity.
Okay. Russell is the Revised Universal Soil Loss Equation. It's a better acronym than it is a descriptor, but it describes soil loss, erosion. So if that's an impact that you really want to measure, that's the most important impact, you might want to use a sophisticated tool like this to get that information. Descent. Has anyone used Descent? You've used Descent. What did you use it for?
Actually, I use like a Century. It's kind of Descent.
Oh, okay.
But
Yes,
the same base data that we use. We use for like a cassava production in Thailand. Was it the cassava and the land use change, land pattern change from cassava? What's the impact from like a soil carbon sequestration?
Okay. Cassava production.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, it was designed to model greenhouse gases, so it can simulate from different agricultural production types what your emissions will be. So those are just some examples of some specific biophysical modeling tools. We also have tools that are designed to look more comprehensively at the impacts in ecosystem services. What are the human benefits that are changed? So I'm going to just discuss a few of them briefly and go in a little more detail into INVEST. So the Cool Farm tool is really designed for farmers to use. It's an app, essentially. It's a website you can go to, and you select one of these crops, and it has a series of drop-down menus that make it very easy to estimate changes in terms of ecosystem services. So these are some of the data inputs. You get a little menu. You say, how big is your farm? Well, how much do you irrigate? What are your practices? And it very quickly gives you some outputs. So it's designed for farmers. It gives you very quick information. You don't really know how it's calculating this. So maybe if you're determining national policy, it's a little too broad, right? A large consortium of partners supported by Jeff developed a more rigorous set of tools targeted at producers, again focused on carbon, but also capable of modeling water use. It's called the Carbon Benefits Project. Again, you make an account and you have an online tool, and there's a simple assessment and a complex assessment. Same system where you enter information about your farm, but you have a little more ability to change variables and make it more specific to your situation. This is being expanded to larger and larger agricultural areas to estimate carbon footprint of different agricultural practices. Has anyone been involved with the Carbon Benefits Project? Jeff? No? Okay. Oh, So Invest. I bet I'll get some hands with this one. Has anyone used Invest or seen the outputs from Invest? Okay, few people. Maybe back there. Invest is probably the most widely known and used software for modeling ecosystem services. And when we say modeling, usually people refer to a type of software. A model is anything that's explaining, right? It's anything that's predicting. But today, in 2018, when we say a model, we usually refer to a software package that does something. And Invest is a software package you can download for free, from the Natural Capital Project website. It was developed by the Natural Capital Project years ago and has been expanded to cover many ecosystem services. So when you download it, you get all these different modules. Here's a list of all the modules that you can download for free and estimate. Some of them only model the biophysical production or the landscape or ecosystem function that's occurring. Others model the true human benefits, the ecosystem services. And some of them even include some general calculations of the economic value of those ecosystem services, where it's possible. Well, how does it work? It's relatively quickly and easily learned, but you have to know how to use GIS, or you need a GIS expert on your team to use Invest, because you need to use spatial files, raster files of land cover and land contours. A GEM is a geographic elevation model. You put those into the, and you add to that information about precipitation, evapotranspiration, land use. And what I like about Invest is that only a few GIS files are required to run the model, and everything else is already populated with some average values. Now, of course, if you run it like that, it won't be specific to your region, but you can change those values if you get better data. Therefore, you could run the model as you're collecting data and see if the new data you get improves how it changes the outcomes. And so one of the drop-down menus you get is a biophysical table. And you can change the variables in the biophysical table. It might be the depth of your topsoil, or it might be the type of soil you have, the conductivity of that soil. There's a lot of little variables you could change. It's a spatially based model based on pixels. So it sets a bunch of values for a pixel. They get a unique set of attributes, and then they're related to each other. So what I'm showing here is the water yield model. Whoop, keep forgetting to move my slides. And so each of these pixels might get an arrow showing what direction from the elevation map that water would flow. And then the biophysical table of the characteristics about that pixel would tell you how much, how quickly that water might travel through that system. So you alter this table in the software. And then in terms of outputs, you get both maps and tables. You get a map that can be by pixel to show you where was the water yield for every pixel. And then you have it looks kind of smooth from a big area, that top map. Or you can ask it to just tell me by water basin, by sub-basin, which one is producing the most water or the least water. And that's the bottom map there. And you also have a table that's estimating actual acre feet or probably cubic meters of water. So Invest, it has generalized layers, but the accuracy depends upon building your own input maps, your own tables from primary data can improve its accuracy. It's free. It does a lot of the heavy lifting, meaning the hard math on its own. It does require some data layers, but they're pretty simple to input if you know how to use GIS and you have someone who can use GIS. It works with ArcGIS and the free version QGIS. But it does not distinguish between a stock of natural capital and a flow of ecosystem services. It's kind of combining a few steps of the modeling process into one. And the outputs, particularly the values, can be very sensitive to assumptions you make. So if you assume a carbon price, that's going to really influence your value on a carbon model. If you take a different carbon price, you might have very different conclusions. So what we've seen is that models range from very user-friendly, easy tools like the Cool Farm model, the app that you use online, to very complex connections of algorithms. The Decent model, Century, they're pretty complex. You're programming a statistical software to do exactly what you want. For more information about modeling, this WRI report, it's called the Guide for Selecting Ecosystem Service Models for Decision Making, is very helpful. It produced this table, and I love this table as a representative of TEEB because the first question they're asking is the same first question as the TEEB 6-step approach. What policy question do we want to inform? And it says if you can identify that policy question, then you can say what information will influence that policy question, and that will determine what model you need to use to produce that information. If we instead look at it from a more traditional, say, land use change science, where we just want to know what happens generally, we might do a lot of modeling with a lot of tools, but never come to the information that's going to change the policy, that's never going to give the policymaker what they need. So it's important to start with that. So we can ask ourselves, is that simple cause and effect model, the very first step, enough to influence the policymakers? Do we need to know about ecosystem service provision, how it's changing human benefits? Or do we need to include feedbacks? There was some mention earlier of systems dynamics modeling. So we've been discussing these first two circles here, modeling changes in the drivers and modeling those impacts on ecosystem services. But perhaps those things influence each other. So those previous examples, I was just talking about two time periods, now and future. What will change? But time is continuous. So ideally, we would run the model for 1 year and then say, with those changes, how will that affect what will happen next year? And create a dynamic feedback. That's commonly referred to as system dynamics. System dynamics isn't a model. It's combining models over time to see dynamic change. When Thomas was introducing the status quo with a blue bar graph and then these potential futures, there were lines connecting the two. Well, we didn't model that path. We just said, here's where we are today, here's where we are tomorrow, and we drew a line to connect the two dots. A dynamic model would say, is that path direct, or does it increase? Is it exponential? Is it decreasing over time? So this is you can't read every little area, of course, but it's a schematic of a dynamic model. That's usually the first step, and we would do this with the agri-food framework as well. We would use the agri-food framework to look at a scenario or a situation and say, where would they be feedbacks between a stock and a flow? Where would there be an impact that causes accelerated impact or decelerated impact in the next time period? And we would first draw it out, real simple. You could just take a piece of paper to try and, in your head, get a grasp of what is the dynamic situation in this scenario. But I imagine if we go to talk to policymakers, we might get some questions that are a little more basic. They might say, why do I care? What is the impact on incomes? What is the impact to livelihoods? Sorry. And this is that last stage, this modeling the consequences of those ecosystem service changes. What are the social and human health implications that my colleague will talk about? So I'm going to play a short video to lead into the valuation part of the
Mr. Johnson?
Yes?
Mother Nature here. I'm here to collect for last month's nature usage.
Nature usage?
Okay, let me see. The sun rose and set. Oh, look at that. Every day. There was that cool breeze on Tuesday. And let's not forget gravity. Oh, but I see you had that bundled with trees and apples. The Isaac Newton package. And last week you stood at the rim of the Grand Canyon for that amazing view. Can't put a price tag on that, can you? Just kidding. We did. Here it is. And you're going to get credit for the new rain barrel and the tree you planted. That should just about offset all the electricity you used with that air conditioner. Let's just call it a wash. Hey! What? You do it to my house all the time. And I see you're running a little behind on your oxygen bill. I wouldn't let that continue very long if I were you, Mr. Johnson.
Well, I'm a little short this week, so I...
So, will that be cash or charge?
Has anyone seen that before? It's a TEEB video we show from time to time. Yesterday, Solomon, the TEEB coordinator, made a comment that nature is not for sale. And the TEEB mission is to make the value of nature visible. So, how can he say nature is not for sale, but we're trying to explain the value of nature? What does that mean? Well, in spirit, nature is not for sale means that it has an intrinsic value. It has this intrinsic infinite value. And many of us, especially in conservation, believe that. But in practice, that idea that nature has an intrinsic value has often meant that it's being given away for free, that we're not accounting for its value in our decision making. So plan A was maybe to simply recognize the wonders of the natural world and the benefits of nature, and then to love it and to care for it. But plan A has kind of failed, right? We're not living sustainably, so plan B is to use tools, to use information, and perhaps valuation to make the contribution of nature more obvious, so that the effects of production and consumption are visible. And we can therefore raise awareness of how the environment supports life. So we might want to use valuation to answer some of these questions. How much do we benefit from the natural ecosystem? What would be the benefits and costs of one policy compared to another? What are the trade-offs between exploitation and sustainable management? And how much money is it worth investing in conservation? From a policymaker's perspective, they might want to know two different things. Valuation refers to the total benefit to people. But often, a particular policymaker might want to know the economic impact. They might want to know the dollars spent, the financial value. They want to know whose jobs, who's gained a job and who's lost a job. They might want to know how much has it affected GDP. And that's economic impact analysis. Valuation is just the net worth. It could be measured in the willingness to pay or in your avoided costs. There's non-market values that never involve an exchange. No one is ever spending any money, but still have value, can still be put into monetary terms. This sign reads, last seen on road between Truckee Hotel and East River Street, chrome-plated 1960s Gillette razor of enormous sentimental value. So sentimental value is also value. So this woman is saying these species are unprofitable, so they will be laid off. And the question is, can we put every impact, ecosystem service impact, into monetary terms? There's a criticism of valuation that nature is sacred and we should not put a price on nature. But to be clear, valuation is not putting a price on nature. It's revealing or estimating through science and data analysis one of two things: how much nature is contributing to our lives, how much we are benefiting from nature, or how much do we currently pay for the benefits of nature. Again, it could be economic activity, meaning the actual money or jobs, we could model that, or it could be the economic value, the benefits we receive. So if you've learned anything about valuation, you've probably learned before that there are both use values and non-use values. Oops. There's direct values when we directly use something, but there could be indirect values. Things such as flood control or nutrient retention, we don't directly use, we don't consume, but they benefit our lives. We may also have value for things just to be available for our children. These option values, bequest values. Or, as Africa knows well, people will invest a lot of money in things they may never experienced. There are a lot of people in other parts of the world that love elephants, and they've never seen an elephant. They want to know that elephants exist. And so that's an existence value. It's important to them. It makes them happier, even if there's no direct use of it. So we may need to use some unique methods to get all these values. And we start by asking some questions. Is the ecosystem bought or sold? Is there a market? Is the value we're looking at, the impact we're trying to measure, is it expressed in markets? If we're talking about crop production, if it's marketed crop production, it's pretty straightforward. There are records of that. If it's subsistence production, what is consumed at home, maybe that's more difficult. It has to be revealed through an indirect market or some more unique methods. Then we can ask ourselves, what kind of data would we have to collect to get this information, and what kind of value do we want to measure? Do we want to measure that human benefit, that economic value? Or do we want to measure the economic impact, actual dollars or shillings? And then to whom? Maybe the most important thing is who's benefiting or losing, not how much. So I'm going to give you one example. Yesterday, our colleagues from Mexico, from Conabio, presented a study on maize. And so maize is a common commodity crop that's sold around the world, right? But it's also, in Mexico in particular, it's grown for auto consumption, for consuming at home. So it's not revealed in markets, but it still has a value to those households, right? We could call that a replacement cost or an avoided cost. If you had to go to the store and buy that maize, how much would it cost you? How would you replace those nutrients for your family? And so one simple method for calculating that is to multiply the harvest at the household level that's consumed at home times the closest replacement in the market. What is the price of the closest replacement in the market? Subtract their costs to grow the corn at home, and you have a replacement cost estimate of the value of corn to that household. But another thing that Conabio pointed out, that Mauricio, our colleague, pointed out, was that in Mexico, corn has more values than just the product, right? In fact, if you did a profit maximization economic study, you might see that the farmers were growing more than you think they would. Their costs aren't even covering all of their production. Maybe they're not valuing their own time, but why would they be doing that? Perhaps it has a cultural value. Perhaps it has a historic value to their family. Maybe it's a security system that they grow too much so that they have a buffer in case. This could also have another value to society. It could have this benefit, that's been explored by Conabio, of greater genetic diversity of corn. In the US, we don't grow corn on a small scale like that anymore. No one saves their seeds to grow in the next generation. All our corn is the same. In Mexico, there's hundreds of varieties of corn because these individual households over generations and generations have saved their corn. And so they're more resilient. If there's a plague on one type of corn, they have these options. That's a public benefit. That's a value that needs to be added to this subsistence value. So in the end, if we're doing valuation, we always want to get to the total economic value that includes those other benefits, those non-market benefits. So I'm just going to explain a couple of valuation methods before I pass it to my colleague Will. That replacement cost method is often used for subsistence production. Could also be used for something like pollination. If bees are pollinating crops, and your bee population dies, and you have to walk around with a little toothpick and pollinate all your crops, that's very expensive. What would be the replacement cost to have that done? Another is the production function. How much does nature contribute to the output? If you have rain-fed agriculture and you have irrigation agriculture, you might have an easy comparison between how, if you're producing the same from both systems, but one of your inputs is coming from for free, it's an ecosystem service, and the other one you have to pay for. You can measure how much does the added water contribute to the output. What if you stopped irrigating? What would you lose? What if the rain didn't come? Avoided cost is often used for things like erosion or sedimentation, because those have a cost to downstream, often to hydroelectric dams, or to or it could be the sedimentation could be a positive value, could be a positive ecosystem service if it provides nutrition to farming. And lastly, we have two types of methodologies for estimating tourism values or existence values. These are revealed and stated preferences. Revealed preferences, there's a related market. Let's say you travel to a lake and you go every weekend with your family, and it doesn't cost anything to appreciate the clean lake, but you have expenditures. You pay for your gasoline to get there, perhaps. You pay for your beach blanket. These are travel expenditure costs, and that can help reveal the value of that lake to you. Or you see that there's housing that's near a lake or near a clean river, and it's more expensive because people want that nice nature nearby, and it increases the cost of the housing. Well, we can use that difference in the cost of the housing to reveal the value of that. This is related to agriculture because some types of agriculture are seen as a desirable benefit to living near them. If you think of like a French vineyard and how people pay so much to get to visit the French vineyard or see the French vineyard, maybe the houses that are next to it are extremely expensive. There could be other housing that's maybe next to a feedlot, next to a cow feedlot that is very, very cheap because that's a disamenity, that's an ecosystem disservice being close to agriculture in that way. And then lastly, when you've run out of all those options, you can simply ask people, what would you pay? What would you trade? How much time would you give up for such and such benefit? And all of these different methods can help put a clearer, visible value on these services from nature that help you inform a policymaker what they should do. So I guess while we're getting Will up here, if anyone has any specific questions just about my presentation, you can ask them. And Will will introduce social and health values, and we'll return to the worksheet to fill in the last bit before we adjourn for the day.